They said the hospital was the safest place for me, a fortress of order and care. But nothing about my nights here felt safe anymore. Started a week ago. I woke up, sprawled on the cold linoleum floor of the East Wing corridor, the fluorescent lights above flickering like nervous eyelids. My room was locked from the inside, as it always was, but I wasn't in it. My breath caught in my throat as I stood, my hands trembling, reaching for the faint outline of the scratches etched into my forearm. 3 lines, deep enough to sting but shallow enough not to bleed much. They weren't there when I went to sleep. I shuffled back to my room, the shadows of the empty hallway closing in on me. I told the nurse, but her face crumpled into pity. "It's probably sleepwalking," she said, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "Happens sometimes in environments like this." Sleepwalking, that word clung to me, wrapping itself around my sanity like a noose. I tried to convince myself that's all it was, a minor aberration, but then it happened again, and again. Each time, I woke in stranger places. Once in the laundry room, another time outside the locked ward door, my fingertips raw as if I'd been clawing at something in my sleep. New marks appeared on my body. Faint bruises along my wrists, scratches on my legs, and once, disturbingly, what looked like claw marks across my chest. They felt deliberate, like something or someone had placed them there. Last night was the worst. When I woke, I wasn't alone. I was in the hospital garden, the brittle December air biting into my skin. The moon hovered like a baleful eye above the skeletal trees. But it wasn't the cold that froze my veins. It was the silhouette of someone or something, standing at the edge of the garden. Too tall, too still, its head cocked, almost curiously, as it stared in my direction. I blinked, and it was gone. The nurses found me an hour later, huddled in the corner of the garden, my fingers digging into the frozen dirt. They led me back to my room like I was a child, their whispers sharp as razors behind my back. When the door clicked shut behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the window. The moonlight carved deep hollows into my face. That's when I noticed it. A smear of dirt beneath my nails, and a single word etched faintly into the pale skin of my forearm. Help! The following night, I decided not to sleep. I sat upright in bed, my back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall, the blanket pulled tightly around me. Every nerve in my body screamed for rest, but the fear of waking somewhere else, or worse, with more marks, kept me sharp. The clock on the wall ticked slower than usual, each second dragging like a noose tightening. The hospital had a rhythm at night. The shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant hum of machines, the occasional groan of a patient down the hall. But as the hours slipped by, I noticed something new. A sound buried in the quiet, faint and skittering, like claws or nails scraping against metal. I held my breath. It wasn't coming from outside my room. It was inside. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I was on the edge of calling out for the night nurse when I heard it again. This time it wasn't scraping. It was a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. "Max?" it rasped, drawing out my name as if savoring it. "Do you remember?" My stomach churned, a wave of nausea crashing over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though the air itself had thickened, pressing me into place. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Come back to us." A sharp knock on my door snapped me out of my paralysis. The light from the hallway spilled into the room as the night nurse peeked inside. "Max, are you all right?" I thought I heard something. I wanted to tell her everything. The whispers, the clawing sounds, the growing dread gnawing at me like a starving animal. But all I could manage was a weak shake of my head. "It's nothing," I muttered, my voice hollow. "Just a bad dream." She hesitated, her gaze lingering on me longer than usual before she closed the door. The lock clicked, and the shadows reclaimed the room. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, Stress, exhaustion, the side effects of the medication they gave me, any explanation to tether myself to reality. But when I glanced down at my hand, my breath caught in my throat. My fingernails were caked with dirt again, and clutched in my palm was something that hadn't been there before. A shard of broken glass, slick with a dark, sticky residue. Blood. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? My mind spun in frantic circles, trying to piece together the scraps of memory I didn't have. My name whispered from the walls, the dirt under my nails, the blood on the glass. It all pointed to something terrible, something hidden in the fog of my own mind. When the sun rose, I expected relief, but the light only made the room feel smaller. The marks on my body itched under my hospital gown, a constant reminder that I wasn't in control. Not of my body, and certainly not of my nights. By midday, the staff called me into a therapy session. Dr. Lowry sat across from me, her notebook balanced on her lap. She always wore the same pitying smile, the same two kind eyes that made me feel like a child under a microscope. "Max," she began, her pen poised, "the nurses are worried about you. You've been wandering again." I swallowed hard, the weight of her stare pressing on me. "I don't remember it. I don't remember any of it." "That's not unusual," she said, scribbling something down. "You've been under a great deal of stress. Sleepwalking can be a coping mechanism." "That's not what this is," I said, sharper than I intended. My voice cracked, and I hated the way it made me sound. Weak, scared. "It's not just walking around. Something else. Something's happening to me." Her pen paused. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. Should I tell her about the whispers? About the blood? The claw marks? But I already knew how it would go. She'd up my meds, say I was hallucinating, tuck me deeper into the suffocating embrace of this place. "I don't know," I lied. "It just feels wrong." Her pen resumed its scratching, and I felt the door close between us. She didn't believe me. They never did. When the session ended, I wandered the hospital corridors, trying to shake the growing knot of unease in my chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their sterile hum filling the void where my thoughts should have been. That's when I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, one I didn't recognize. It was unmarked, blending seamlessly into the white walls. But there was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. My feet moved toward it on their own, as though pulled by an invisible thread. When I reached it, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, a sudden wave of dread washing over me. I didn't want to open it. I needed to open it. The handle was cold under my fingers, the metal biting into my skin. I turned it slowly, the hinges groaning like a wounded animal. The air that greeted me was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something sharper, something metallic. The room was dark, but not completely. A faint glow spilled from somewhere deep inside, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, scrawled across the wall in thick, uneven strokes, were words that stopped me cold. "It's not you, it's US." The door slammed shut behind me. The slam of the door behind me echoed like a gunshot, reverberating through the stale, oppressive air. My body jolted, and for a moment, I stood frozen, my breath ragged. I turned slowly, reaching for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Of course it was. I forced myself to turn back toward the wall, the words looming in the dim light. "It's not you. It's US." They were written in what looked like a mixture of dirt and blood, the strokes uneven, frantic. Something about them felt familiar. My fingers tingled, and I realized they were twitching, mimicking the motion of writing. The faint glow I'd noticed earlier came from a corner of the room, illuminating what looked like a pile of discarded hospital gowns. The room smelled of mildew and something sour, something alive. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But there was no leaving. Not yet. The glow wasn't from a light or a device. It came from the floor itself, faintly pulsating like a heartbeat. As I knelt to inspect it, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. A bracelet, stained and tarnished. I picked it up, squinting in the weak light. It had a name etched into the surface, barely visible through the grime. Maria. I felt a jolt of recognition, though I couldn't place why. Maria. That name rattled something loose in my mind, a memory blurred at the edges. A woman's face, her voice soft but urgent. Max, you have to stop it. You have to stop. Asterisk stop what? A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. It came from deeper within the room, beyond the pile of gowns. I rose slowly, clutching the bracelet like a lifeline. Hello! My voice cracked, the sound swallowed by the darkness. The tapping stopped, and then a whisper. Max? It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it cut through me like a blade. My pulse quickened, every nerve on edge. The darkness ahead seemed to shift, the shadows coalescing into shapes that didn't belong. I backed away, but the glow from the floor brightened, bathing the room in a sickly light. That's when I saw them. The pile of gowns wasn't just gowns. It was bodies, tangled together in a grotesque heap. Their faces were obscured, but their hands were outstretched, fingers twisted and clawing at nothing. And on every wrist was a bracelet, identical to the one I held, each engraved with a different name. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat. I staggered backward, my foot catching on something soft. I looked down and saw another body, half buried under the others. Its face was turned toward me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was me, the same hollow eyes, the same sharp features. My face, pale and lifeless, staring back at me. A sharp gasp escaped my lips as I stumbled further, the walls seeming to close in. My own dead hand clutched another bracelet, this one engraved with a name I didn't recognize. Edwin. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing from all around me. Max, come back. The walls seemed to shift, the air growing colder. The light from the floor pulsed faster, erratic, matching the frantic beat of my heart. I didn't understand what I was seeing, what I was feeling, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in here. The air in the room thickened, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The heap of bodies seemed to shift in the flickering light, the pale, lifeless hands twitching as if trying to reach me. The bracelet in my grip felt heavier, colder, and the name Maria burned into my mind like a brand. Max! The whisper came again, louder this time, curling around me like smoke. My name had never sounded so alien, so wrong. I turned toward the voice, my pulse pounding in my ears, and saw a figure emerge from the darkness. At first, it looked human, a person shrouded in shadow. But as it stepped closer, its form twisted, elongating in unnatural ways. Its head cocked at an impossible angle, and its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light that burned into me. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements fluid and silent. I backed away instinctively, but the wall pressed against my shoulders, cold and unyielding. Stay away, I croaked, my voice trembling. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a chorus, layered and resonant, as if dozens of voices spoke through it. You carry their weight, it said. You've forgotten, but your body remembers. What are you talking about? I demanded, though the words came out weak and brittle. My gaze flicked to the heap of bodies, the pile of names. Who are they? What is this? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed toward the bracelet in my hand. You've held the truth before, it said, its tone almost pitying. But you let it go. Over and over, you let it go. The bracelet felt like ice in my palm. I don't know what you mean, I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. I don't remember any of this. Not yet, the figure interrupted, stepping closer. Its movements seemed to distort the air around it, warping the light and shadows. But you will. The names will guide you. I looked down at the bracelet again, the letters of Maria's name seeming to shimmer in the dim glow. And then, as if on cue, the other names carved into the bracelets began to surface in my mind. Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Faces followed, blurry but familiar. Flashes of people I couldn't name but knew I'd seen before. Who are they? I whispered, my voice breaking. What did I do? The figure tilted its head again, those burning eyes narrowing. You open the door, it said simply. Now you must close it, before it's too late. What door? My voice rose, frantic now. What door? It didn't answer. Instead, it began to retreat, fading back into the darkness as if dissolving into the room itself. The pulsing light dimmed, and the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. I was alone again, but not entirely. The pile of bodies shifted, and a single hand emerged from the heap, its fingers curling weakly toward me. The face beneath the pile tilted upward, bloodied and contorted but unmistakably mine. Its mouth opened, and it rasped one word, barely audible but filled with urgency. Run! The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and absolute. My breaths came shallow and fast, and I gripped the bracelet as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. Somewhere in the black void, the voice came again. Not a whisper now, but a guttural, rasping echo that bounced off the walls. Run! The sound of shifting bodies filled the air, wet, slithering movements, as if the pile of corpses was waking. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the wall behind me. My fingers grazed something rough, and I realized it was the edge of the door. I clawed at the handle, yanking and twisting until it gave way, the door creaking open to spill me into the corridor. The sterile light of the hospital burned my eyes, but I didn't stop. I ran, my bare feet slapping against the linoleum floor, the bracelet still clutched tightly in my hand. Behind me, I could hear them, footsteps, faint at first but growing louder, heavier. They weren't mine. They weren't human. The hospital's endless corridors twisted and stretched, warping into a surreal labyrinth. The buzzing fluorescence flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me as I ran. Every turn led to another identical hallway, the walls lined with unmarked doors. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to keep moving. Then I heard it. The voice again, closer this time, reverberating through the air like a low growl. Max, you can't escape. I skidded to a halt, pressing myself against the wall, my chest heaving. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a sickening, wet slapping noise. Whatever was following me wasn't far behind. My gaze darted around, searching for an escape, when I noticed one of the unmarked doors. Unlike the others, this one was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible between the frame and the door. Without thinking, I lunged for it, pushing it open and slipping inside. The room was small and cold, illuminated only by a faint, bluish glow. At its center stood a single hospital bed, its sheets rumpled and stained. Medical equipment surrounded it, the machines silent but still powered, their lights blinking in eerie synchronization. The air smelled of antiseptic and decay. And then I saw it. On the bed lay a figure, motionless, covered in a thin sheet. My legs felt like they'd been rooted to the floor as I approached, drawn by some terrible compulsion. My trembling hand reached for the edge of the sheet, and I pulled it back. It was me. The figure was pale and lifeless. The same features I'd seen in the pile of bodies now twisted in a grotesque mask of fear. My chest felt tight, the air around me seeming to vibrate with a low hum. I staggered backward, my pulse racing. The bracelet in my hand began to glow faintly, the name Maria burning brighter than before. A voice, her voice, whispered in my mind. You can't run from it, Max. You have to face it. The door behind me creaked open, and a shadow spilled into the room. The air grew colder, and I could feel it. Something massive, something wrong, standing in the doorway. My mind screamed at me to turn, to face it, but my body refused to move. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural symphony of pain and rage. You are the door. The words hit me like a physical blow. You are the door. They echoed inside my skull, rattling against the fragile walls of my sanity. My body trembled as the shadow in the doorway shifted, its shape twisting unnaturally. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. The figure on the bed, my body, remained lifeless, its pale eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. The bracelet in my hand pulsed again, the name Maria glowing brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Her voice whispered once more, clearer now, her tone laced with urgency. Close it, Max, before it's too late. What does that mean? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. What door? I don't understand. The shadow stepped into the room, its movements fluid and unnatural. Its eyes, burning pinpricks of light, locked onto me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness radiating from it. This wasn't just a thing. It was things, a writhing mass of something unknowable, wearing the shape of a nightmare. You opened it, it said, its voice layered with countless others, some pleading, others condemning. And now you must pay the price. The bracelet in my hand grew hot, the name Maria searing into my palm. Images flashed in my mind, memories maybe, or something deeper. I saw myself in another hospital room, surrounded by the same lifeless walls, the same cold sterility. But I wasn't alone. There were others, patients, nurses, staff, all staring at me with hollow eyes. And then, one by one, they began to vanish, pulled into the shadows that writhed and clawed at the edges of my vision. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I didn't. You did. The voices snarled, the shadow looming closer. You let us in. The memories flooded back, pieces of a puzzle snapping together with cruel clarity. I had been desperate, consumed by grief, by fear, by a need to escape something I couldn't name. I had sought answers in places I wasn't meant to tread, opening doors that should have remained closed. And in doing so, I had unleashed them. The bracelet burned brighter, the other names, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas, illuminating one by one. Each name brought another flash of memory, another face twisted in terror as they disappeared into the void. They had trusted me. I had betrayed them. The shadow reached for me, its clawed hand stretching impossibly long, its fingers curling around the air. You are the door, Max, it said again, its voice dripping with malice. And we are what lies beyond. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the bed. My own lifeless body stared up at me, its face frozen in a scream I didn't remember making. The shadow loomed over both of us now, its form pulsating with dark energy. No, I screamed, gripping the bracelet tightly. This ends now. The voice of Maria surged in my mind, her words clear and commanding. Close it, Max. Focus. Remember who you are. The bracelet burned with searing heat, and I raised it instinctively, holding it out toward the shadow. Light erupted from it, blinding and pure, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadow recoiled, its form twisting and writhing as it let out a guttural scream that seemed to shake the very walls. You cannot contain us? It roared, its voice splintering into a cacophony of wails. But I didn't stop. I focused on the names, the faces, the lives I had failed. The light from the bracelet grew brighter, filling the room, filling me, until the shadow was nothing but a distant echo. And then silence. The room was empty. The shadow was gone. My lifeless body on the bed had disappeared, leaving only the faint outline of where it had been. I stood there, trembling, the bracelet still glowing faintly in my hand. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening. A void that seemed to swallow every sound. My hands trembled, the bracelet's glow fading until it was nothing more than a dull glimmer. The air in the room was still, but I could feel it. Something lingered. A presence that hadn't been banished, only silenced. I glanced down at the bracelet. The names were still etched into its surface, but they were faint now, barely legible. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. The faces that had flooded my mind moments ago were gone, leaving only a hollow ache in their place. They felt incomplete, as if the stories tied to their names hadn't ended. The door creaked behind me, drawing my attention. It was open again, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. But this time, the hallway wasn't empty. Figures stood in the distance, their outlines flickering like static on an old television. They weren't moving, just watching, their faces obscured by the shadows. Max? The voice came again, but it wasn't the same as before. It was softer, more human. A woman's voice, tinged with sorrow. Maria's voice. I hesitated, every muscle in my body screaming to stay away, to run back into the false safety of the hospital. But there was no safety here. Not anymore. The air felt charged with something electric, something ancient. The only way forward was through. I stepped into the corridor, the cold floor biting at my bare feet. The figures didn't move as I approached, their forms growing clearer with each step. They weren't people. Not really. They were shadows shaped like people, their edges flickering and fraying like burned paper. As I drew closer, I saw their wrists. Each one wore a bracelet identical to mine. The names glowed faintly against their dark skin, and my chest tightened as I recognized them. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. They weren't just names. They were the shadows. They were here. Why? I whispered, my voice breaking. Why are you here? Maria's shadow stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. The glow of her bracelet intensified, casting faint light on her indistinct features. You let us in, she said, her voice layered with sadness and something else, something accusing. I didn't know, I pleaded, backing away. I didn't understand. You opened the door, she interrupted. We trusted you, and you let us fall. Her words cut deep, sharper than any physical wound. Flashes of memory bombarded me. Moments I had buried, things I had done to escape the nightmare I thought I could contain. They had been part of it, trapped by my actions, victims of my desperation. I can fix this, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. My voice cracked under the weight of the guilt pressing on my chest. Just tell me how. The shadows flickered, the other names glowing brighter now. Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Their voices joined Maria's, a chorus of anguish and pain. You must finish what you started, they said in unison. You must close the door. How? I demanded, desperation clawing at me. I don't even know what the door is. Maria's shadow raised her hand, pointing toward the end of the corridor. The shadows parted, revealing a single door at the far end. It was unlike the others, tall, impossibly black, its surface pulsing with a faint, unnatural light. The very sight of it made my stomach turn, a deep, primal fear rising in me. That is the door, Maria said. The one you opened, the one you must close. I took a step back, shaking my head. I can't. I don't even know how to. You can, she said firmly, stepping closer. You must, or they will take you. All of you. The air around me grew colder, the faint hum of the hospital fading into an eerie silence. The shadows began to recede, their bracelets dimming as they sank into the walls, their presence lingering like a ghostly afterimage. I was alone again, standing in the corridor, staring at the door that pulsed at the far end. The bracelet in my hand glowed faintly, the names burning like tiny embers. I didn't understand everything, but one thing was clear. I had to face whatever lay beyond that door. The door loomed at the end of the corridor, its surface pulsing faintly as though alive, breathing. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to flee into the maze of hospital halls and lose myself in their sterile embrace. But I knew better now. There was no safety in running. Not here. Not anymore. The bracelet in my hand felt heavy, the names etched into its surface faintly glowing with an eerie light. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Their faces flickered in my mind, their voices echoing in the silence. You must close the door. I forced my feet to move, one hesitant step at a time, my heart hammering in my chest. The corridor stretched and warped as I approached, the walls bending inward like the ribs of some great, unseen beast. Shadows pooled at my feet, swirling like smoke, reaching for me. I clutched the bracelet tighter, the cool metal grounding me in the face of the impossible. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Up close, its surface wasn't just black. It was shifting, rippling like water caught in the moonlight. Faces pressed against it, their features distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin. A voice whispered from the darkness behind me, low and guttural. Do you really think you can undo what's been done? I froze, my breath hitching. Turning slowly, I saw it, the shadowy figure from before, its shape shifting and writhing as though it were made of smoke and tar. Its glowing eyes burned into me, and its presence seemed to fill the corridor, pressing against my skin, my mind. You opened this door, it said, its voice layered with malice and amusement. You invited us in, and now you think you can shut us out. I have to, I said, though my voice trembled. I have to fix this. The figure laughed, a deep, resonant sound that made the walls shudder. You don't even understand what you've done, do you? The lives you've consumed, the horrors you've unleashed. The faces on the door pressed harder against the surface, their mouths moving now, though no sound escaped. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to look away. You're not strong enough, the figure continued, stepping closer. You never were. The bracelet in my hand flared, the names burning brighter, their heat searing into my palm. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Their voices surged in my mind, defiant and unyielding. Don't listen to it, Max, Maria's voice said, clear and steady. You can do this. You have to. I turned back to the door, my resolve hardening. The shadow behind me hissed, its form twisting and contorting. You'll fail, it spat, its voice filled with venom. And when you do, we'll take you too. Ignoring it, I gripped the handle with both hands. The cold seeped into my skin, and the door resisted as I pulled, the faces on its surface writhing and screaming silently. The light from the bracelet intensified, pouring over the door like molten gold, and the resistance began to give way. The shadow lunged, its claws outstretched, but the light from the bracelet flared brighter, creating a barrier that sent it recoiling with a shriek. The door groaned, its surface trembling, and I pulled harder, using every ounce of strength I had. With a final, deafening screech, the door swung open. What lay beyond wasn't darkness, it was nothing. A void so absolute it defied comprehension, swallowing the light, the air, the very fabric of existence. The pull of it was immense, dragging me toward its center. The bracelet burned in my hand, the names blazing like stars in the emptiness. The shadow howled, its form unraveling as the void reached for it. You don't know what you're doing, it roared, its voice fractured and desperate. But I didn't stop. I raised the bracelet, the names now a blinding light that pierced the void. The pull intensified, and the shadow dissolved into the nothingness, its screams fading into silence. The void began to collapse, the walls of the corridor rushing inward, folding in on themselves. The light from the bracelet flared one last time, and the door slammed shut with a deafening finality. And then, there was nothing. When the nothingness faded, I found myself on the floor of my hospital room, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The bracelet was gone, leaving only a faint, ghostly warmth in my hand. The oppressive silence was replaced by the faint hum of the hospital, distant voices, the rhythmic beep of monitors, the shuffle of footsteps down the hall. For a moment, I thought it might all have been a nightmare. But then I saw them. The marks. They were everywhere. Faint, pale scars running up my arms and legs, circling my wrists and ankles. They didn't hurt, but they pulsed faintly under my skin, like echoes of something that had been, and still was, inside me. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and stumbled to the small mirror above the sink. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed and pale. But there was something else, something wrong. My eyes, they weren't just tired. They were wrong. The faintest glimmer of something unnatural flickered in their depths. A trace of the door, of the void, that refused to leave me. I turned away, my stomach twisting. The room felt too small, too confining, the walls closing in like a vice. I needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of my own reflection. I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't belong in a place like this. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, their glow casting long, sharp shadows on the linoleum floor. The nurse's station was empty. The entire ward felt abandoned. "Hello!" My voice echoed, thin and frail. No answer. I wandered down the corridor, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of the door was still with me, dragging me down. I passed room after room, their doors ajar, their beds neatly made. No patients, no staff. I turned a corner and stopped short. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless, its back to me. My breath caught, and I froze, my pulse quickening. It was Maria. She wore the same hospital gown, her hair falling in loose, dark waves over her shoulders. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head was tilted slightly, as though listening for something. The sight of her sent a jolt of recognition through me, but it was wrong. She was wrong. "Maria!" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my legs shaking. "Maria, is that you?" Still no response. The air grew colder the closer I got, my breath misting in the faint light. When I was only a few feet away, she turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her face, oh God, her face. It was Maria, but not. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen, her mouth twisted into an expression of agony and fear. Her lips parted, and a voice emerged. A voice that was not hers. "You can't close it." The words struck me like a blow, and I staggered backward. Maria's figure dissolved, unraveling like smoke, leaving nothing but the empty hallway. I was alone again, or so I thought. The walls around me began to shift, the faint outlines of names and faces pressing through the paint. Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Their voices rose, overlapping, an incomprehensible chorus of anguish and accusation. "You didn't finish it?" they whispered, their words slicing through me like knives. "It's not over." The ground beneath me trembled, and the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into momentary darkness. When they came back on, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was standing before the door again, the same impossibly black surface, the same writhing faces pressed against it. But this time it was different. The door wasn't closed. It was cracked open, a faint, pulsing light spilling through the gap. And from beyond the door, something stirred. The door stood before me again, its surface shifting like liquid shadow. The faint crack down its center oozed light, sickly and pulsating, and the air around it hummed with energy that made my teeth ache. The faces pressed against the surface were more pronounced now, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly, their eyes filled with desperation. My breath caught in my throat. I thought I had closed it, I thought I had done what was necessary. But here it was again, a crack in the fabric of everything I thought I had sealed. And from beyond the door I felt it, the thing I had tried to trap. It wasn't just stirring. It was waking. The bracelet was gone. But the names it bore burned in my mind like a brand. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. They had trusted me, urged me to stop what I had unleashed. But I had failed. And now, whatever lay beyond that door wasn't just coming for me. It was coming for everything. I stepped closer, the pull of the door stronger now, more insistent. The hum grew louder with every step, and the light spilling from the crack seemed to seep into my skin, making it burn and itch. My legs trembled, but I kept moving. I had to. There was no running from this, no escaping the consequences of what I had done. When I reached the door, I placed my hands on its cold, shifting surface. The faces pressed against it recoiled at my touch, their expressions twisting into terror and rage. A voice whispered from the crack, low and guttural, a language I didn't understand but felt in my bones. "You're too late," it said, the words clawing at my mind. I gritted my teeth and pushed against the door, trying to force it closed. The surface rippled under my hands, resisting me, the crack widening as though mocking my efforts. The light grew brighter, blinding, and the hum became a deafening roar. I screamed, pouring every ounce of strength into shutting the door, but it wouldn't budge. And then the voices came, not just one or two, but a cacophony of voices, Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. They rose around me, a deafening chorus of despair and urgency. "You can't fight it alone," they cried. "We're here. Let us help." The names burned brighter in my mind, and I felt a surge of energy flood through me. It wasn't just me anymore. They were with me, their strength, their resolve bolstering mine. I placed my hands back on the door and pushed, the light from the crack dimming slightly under the force. But the thing beyond the door wasn't going quietly. A shadow surged through the crack, a writhing, inky mass that lashed out at me, wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me closer. Its touch was cold, searing, and my vision blurred as it whispered in my ear. "Do you really think you can stop me? You opened this door. You belong to me now." "No," I growled, the voices of the names rising in unison with mine. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." With a final, desperate cry, I channeled everything I had, my strength, my fear, my guilt, into the door. The crack shuddered, the light sputtering and fading as the shadow recoiled. The faces on the door screamed silently, their features contorting as the door began to close. The pull of the thing beyond the door was immense, dragging at me with every ounce of its dark power. But I held on, my fingers digging into the surface as the crack narrowed, inch by agonizing inch. The voices of the names pushed me forward, their strength merging with mine, their presence a shield against the darkness. And then, with a deafening slam, the door shut. The silence that followed was absolute. The corridor was empty, the door sealed, its surface smooth and still. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The names in my mind were quiet now, their presence fading but not gone. I felt their gratitude, their relief, like a warm embrace. But even as I lay there, trembling and spent, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The cracks may have been sealed, but the scars remained. I lay on the cold, sterile floor of the corridor, staring at the door. Its surface was smooth now, silent, and devoid of the writhing faces that had haunted me. For the first time in what felt like forever, the oppressive weight was gone. The air was still, almost tranquil, but I knew better than to trust the silence. The faint warmth of the names lingered in my mind. Maria, Edwin, Abigail, Thomas. Their voices were gone, but their presence remained, like shadows in the corners of my thoughts. They had helped me close the door, their strength pulling me back from the brink. But at what cost? The lights above flickered, and I pulled myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, identical, sterile, and utterly empty. The hospital wasn't as I remembered it. Or perhaps it was, but I had changed. I turned, expecting to find the door behind me, but it was gone. The wall was blank, smooth and featureless, as though it had never been there at all. Panic fluttered in my chest. Had I truly sealed it, or had the door simply shifted again? Lurking somewhere else? I began to walk, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Every corner I turned brought me to another identical hallway, the monotony pressing in on me like a vice. The hospital felt alive, its walls pulsing faintly with some unseen rhythm, and no matter how far I went, there was no sign of life. No nurses, no patients, just me. Finally, I came to a familiar door, my room. The number etched into the plaque sent a shiver through me. It was the same door I'd walked through 100 times, but now it felt foreign, hostile. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to go inside. Not after everything. Not now. But I didn't have a choice. I pushed the door open. The room was as I had left it. Bed neatly made, the small mirror above the sink reflecting the dim light. For a moment, I thought I might be safe, but then I saw it. On the bed lay the bracelet. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, its surface pristine. But the names were gone. The metal was blank, as though the weight of the lives it had carried had been stripped away. My stomach twisted, and I stepped closer, my hand reaching out despite myself. As my fingers closed around it, a searing pain shot through me, and the room shifted. The walls rippled, melting into shadow, and the air grew thick and stifling. I staggered back, clutching the bracelet as the whispering began again. "You may have closed the door," a voice hissed, low and venomous, "but you are still the key." The walls folded in on themselves, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around me. The bracelet burned in my hand, its blank surface growing hotter with each passing second. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I was standing in the hospital corridor again, alone. The bracelet was gone. The air was still, the silence complete. But I could feel it, the faint pull of the door, somewhere out there, waiting, watching. I walked slowly back to my bed, my body heavy with exhaustion. As I sank onto the mattress, my gaze drifted to the mirror above the sink. For a moment, I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. My eyes were different now, darker, deeper, as though they carried the weight of something I could never name. The door was closed, for now, but the scars it left behind would never truly fade, and neither would the pull of the thing that waited beyond. Thank you for listening to my story. Like it if you liked it, and write in the comments if it was creepy or not.